The manhwa begins. A lady screams violently as the servants present try to restrain her. The master of the manor arrives and they explain that the lady keeps trying to harm herself and they were only trying to stop her. With that he rushes to her side, immediately holding her arms apart as he yells her name out loud. Aeline. She goes calm and the next moment tears stream down her face as she mutters his name. Relocation? Watching her, he grows increasingly anxious as he recognizes the look in her eyes. She's suffering from mania. Has my curse transferred to her? He grits his teeth painfully, cursing underneath muffled breaths before ordering the servants to leave. Once they're alone, he turns back to Aeline, realizing if things were to continue that way she could die. Without wasting time, he takes a big gulp of a liquid of unknown origin, lifts her head up and slowly feeds the liquid to her mouth as a kiss. The medication seems to work and she goes silent, only to begin confessing bitterly. Relocation, you always make me feel so miserable. Relocation, please, just kill me now. In the past, there was a house fire. She lost her parents to the fumes and after investigation it was revealed the fire started as a result of a lit cigarette butt. During her parents' lifetime, they were poor but at least they had been happy. Now after their death she was left without a family to support her in her dreams of becoming a singer. Just as she questioned how she's supposed to go on living, a strange man appears in front of her and after offering some words of condolences, hands her a paper as he explains he's a representative from EN Entertainment. With his brief introduction she realized he's the president of the entertainment company she interviewed with, alongside her mom before her passing. He offered some words of comfort to her, encouraging her not to give up on the dream she mentioned in her audition, and after shared their intention to work with her. Despite her life as a singer she faced so many difficulties, however knowing with just the thought of her family she could push forward made her happy. At least her dream lasted until she had an accident on a particular day after a long day of work that left her unable to sing anymore. Then, drowned in hopelessness and the belief that life no longer held a place for her, she took her own life, thinking that was the end, until she wakes up in a new body with a person calling her Aeline. She looks around in confusion, suddenly finding herself in an unfamiliar room while the nun taking care of her questions how she could hang herself, disclosing the royal prince's wedding was held the day before. She slowly sits up wondering what the lady is talking about when the lady again states that everyone has been awaiting the wedding of His Highness Luciano and Her Highness Dalsia. Hearing those names, it hits her. Those names belong to the very characters from the novel she was reading before she died. Aeline is politically chosen to marry the supporting male lead, Relocation. Despite the love she harbored for Relocation, he doesn't return her love, instead he loved the main female lead Dalsia. It doesn't take long before Aeline goes mad with jealousy and turns to black magic to curse Dalsia, and eventually when her actions are discovered, everyone treated her like a villainess. Then the novel ends with her being exiled to a convent. She wonders if she's at the end of a novel and then tries to speak, but it's difficult for her. The nun noticing reveals she won't be able to speak. She shares that they tried healing her but it didn't work and questions why she had to hang herself. Please stay quietly in your room, she orders as she takes her leave. Now a cruel realization settles in her mind. She's in a fictional world and yet, her fate hasn't changed. With a few of Aeline's memories in her head, she recalls an extra piece of rope placed right under the mattress and fishes it out. She ties a careful knot, and scoffs at the cruelty of her fate. How ridiculous to be reincarnated into a novel. And to be another voiceless woman at that. God, if you wanted to save me, if you really wanted to give me a new life. But her life doesn't end just yet. She wakes up again, this time with the people around questioning why she's doing this, or perhaps, is it because of the Duke, because she heard of Duke Relocation's engagement to the princess. In a new scene, Aeline kneels in front of the princess questioning how she could do that to her. The princess indifferent asks what the problem is, noting she'd mentioned earlier that she would let her live. Aeline, losing all composure, stammers her questions. Why? Since when? Did you frame me on purpose? She adds, expressing how much she had trusted her, but the princess is unfazed. Instead, she insists it is all because she crossed the line and set her eyes on him. She leans in closer and with a whisper shares. Carloshan Dinabeth was supposed to be mine, everything will fall into place now, you served as a very good card Aeline. She goes further with her mockery stating how Aeline had no idea she had crafted all of that and questions how Aeline could have trusted her like that for just a little bit of kindness. Aeline in despair, breaks down into tears as she declares with her last breath she wouldn't be able to be loved by him either, but the princess with strong resolve remarks that they'll have to wait and see about that. Lastly she retorts. You and I are different Aeline, I am not stupid. She freezes as an image of the dupe comes to her mind and his particular words. I hate stupid women, like you Aeline. The princess takes one last pause before leaving. She wishes Aeline a long life, long enough for her to ensure she hears news of her wedding to the duke. Aeline left alone, her tears hit the ground continuously as her mind is overwhelmed with regret. Carloshan, I should never have loved you. She wakes up and realizes those memories are from the deceased Aeline. She gets up and walks up to a mirror, rubbing her hand gently along the bandage on her neck, unable to believe there was a real backstory, but she has no interest in Aeline's sorrow. Curious, she questions how many times she's tried to hang herself, recalling how after her first suicide attempt failed, she tried again dozens of times. She comes upon an unsettling realization: if she's placed back in time each time, her wounds should be disappearing too, however they don't. She questions why she can't die. After all, the story is long over, so what more could the villainess have left to do in the plot? A sparkle of hope ignites in her mind as she suggests maybe changing locations would do the trick. Perhaps the convent area is prohibiting her from dying somehow. As she approaches the right type of tree with the rope in her hand, a knight suddenly appears. He seems to recognize her while she stares at him in confusion of his identity. He grabs her hand immediately and questions what she's thinking of doing. His grip tightens as he questions what she's thinking of doing with the rope and then notes if she's trying to escape. Aeline gives up struggling as she confronts the reality. Oh right, he's probably seen my bruises, but either way, as she snatched the rope from his hand she thinks, I'm busy and he needs to leave. He calls out to her asking her to stop, but rather she focuses on her goal. She's so close and she can't have him stop her now. Soon a person appears and asks him what's wrong, mentioning he'd run off suddenly, saying he sensed someone's presence. It turns out to be the Crown Prince Rusciano Bolivicia and the Crown Princess Dalsia Bolivicia. The knight immediately reports of Aeline's presence in the woods, and the Crown Prince instructs him to go after her, questioning what trouble she's up to again. He suggests the Crown Princess waits behind since it's quite dangerous in the woods while he and Benjamin go find her. However, the Crown Princess insists on coming with them, as a precaution in case she attempts to use black magic again, he'll need her. On the other hand, Aeline successfully secures a knot on the tree. She slides the hoop onto the neck and leaps off the tree with no intention of letting them have their way. However, yet again, something disrupts her chance at having a peaceful demise. She opens her eyes and looks down to see the knight holding her legs together. She recalls the Crown Prince's knight, Benjamin, who also liked the main female lead, though she doesn't return his interest. She struggles, swinging her leg back and forth in the air while the Crown Prince arrives at this time with the Crown Princess. She presses her eyes shut, thinking she just wanted to die in peace. It wasn't her intention to put on a little suicide show for the main lead characters. The Crown Princess attempts to go to her, however the Crown Prince orders her to step back and then slices the rope the next moment, causing her to drop to the ground. On the ground, the Crown Princess immediately rushes to her, questioning how she could try to kill herself, but Aeline only gazes at the Crown Prince, rethinking her action. Instead, she should have leapt so she could have been killed with his blade. The Crown Princess, who'd been inspecting her body for any signs of hurt, stiffens as her gaze settles on all the cuts on her body. Aeline, what have you been doing? The Crown Princess asks. Aeline finds it ridiculous how she was framed for having cursed her, and yet, the Crown Princess, the saintess, still worries about her. Instead, Aeline responds to her questions in a sharp, detached tone, saying she doesn't need to know. The crown princess only grows more agitated as she questions if her voice is damaged and then almost immediately suggests she heal her. She would heal my voice? Right, Dalsia is a saintess, she's far more powerful than a monk or nun, her healing powers are incredible. Dalsia notes that it's a physical wound so it shouldn't be difficult while Aeline, who seems to have found a new hope with her words, imagines the new possibility. If Dalsia can heal her, if she can use Ariadne's body to sing again, then she doesn't have to keep trying to kill herself. The saintess begins the healing process while Aeline ponders on the novel. In the original novel, the saintess casts it all away. Dalsia is a saintess with healing powers. Her eyes widen as she realizes she'd forgotten how she healed. Even though it's a simple hymn, her voice is so angelic and beautiful. Dalsia heals through songs. A sharp pain attacks her and she grips her neck in pain. Soon enough, a burning sensation spreads inside her throat and as she trembles she urges the saintess to stop singing. The knight immediately rushes to Ariadne's side while the crown princess, confused, questions why it isn't working. It takes just a moment for Ariadne to forget the burning sensations and almost immediately tears stream down her eyes as she scoffs at the harsh reality: she can't be healed. She can never speak or sing again. She struggles to release his grip around her wrist but he doesn't let go and instead urges her to calm down while she sobs uncontrollably, thinking, just let me die. At St. Bally's Cathedral, she sits in the front. She recalls the saintess' words, she must go to the cathedral and St. Bally's will surely heal her if she prays. In her memory the saintess wept so terribly she agreed to come. Funny how she wept harder than her when she's the one who was trying to die. She had agreed to go to the cathedral, however, she had no idea what the topic of discussion was, neither was she willing to know. Instead she only had interest in figuring out why she couldn't end her life when the original story had been completed. She lifts her gaze up and thinks, Ballal, as you really are a saint, then hear my prayer. The next minute, light sparkles on the book and she notices the words in the book changing to a summary of the plot. She picks it up filled with new hopes that maybe the story isn't over yet. She recalls how in the original story Ariadne had mentioned to the Duke that she'll try to kill the princess and make it so that he never forgets about her. However, the Duke with the same indifference had noted it would be unfortunate for her as he doesn't hold on to memories of things that are beneath him. Lastly, she admits he makes her life miserable, however he strongly opposes it, stating it's not him, but she's the one making her own life miserable, and like that she met her end by his sword, harboring unrequited love for the same person who took her life. She springs up, deliberately overlooking every other possibility but the reality that if that's true, she could have the Duke kill her. She rushes out of the mass filled with excitement and gratitude to St. Ballal, but once she gets outside she pauses as an unsettling realization dawns on her. Ariadne could speak. The priest who'd been chasing after her catches up to her and warns that she can't keep doing whatever she feels like, but she doesn't pay him the slightest bit of attention. Instead, she ponders on her new realization. But why is it that she can't speak? If Ariadne in the story could speak, she's supposed to be able to speak too. The priest, intending to scold her once more, pauses as he notices the tears in her eyes. Overwhelmed with guilt, he asks why she's crying. However, the next moment, the crown princess emerges and orders to know what he's doing. Her gaze is stern, causing him to shrink back a bit in fear. She rushes to Ariadne's side and asks why she's crying, if there is a problem, but instead she's faced with strong silence from Ariadne, who considers. Is there really no hope for me? Is there nothing left for me, aside death? If it's like that, then kill me now, please. Later, the crown princess ponders on the situation of Ariadne. From her observation, she concludes the bruises on her neck are far too deep to have been caused by one accident. Instead, they look like they belonged on someone who has attempted suicide multiple times. The crown prince appears and asks what she's thinking about. He asks if perhaps it is because of Ariadne, however she hurriedly denies it. The crown prince appears convinced and shares his observation. Ariadne is calmer than expected. He'd expected her to be raving mad over news of Carloshan's engagement. The crown princess lets out a hesitant laugh and he leans in closer and shares he feels bad they have to stay in that convent even though they are newlyweds, although he understands they had to let the entire empire know of their engagement like that, but he'd really like more time with her alone. Suddenly she springs up in excitement as she exclaims she's got it. To avoid keeping the crown prince in the dark, she reveals she's going to take Aeline to the capital. In a new scene, Aeline stares blankly at the crown prince and princess who look at her excitedly. She recalls how the crown princess had pleaded to be shown her scars and she admits she let her in only because she kept asking. The crown princess speaks and asks that she allows her try to treat her wounds one more time, then she'll leave her alone. As soon as the crown princess begins singing, Aeline presses her lips down bitterly, thinking on how much she hates it. As she watches her sing, she thinks it's not going to work anyway, so she should just hurry up and leave. The crown princess stares at her, and as she grips onto Aeline's hand she announces, "Aeline, you really are incurable, thank you for showing me your scars." Aeline, watching her leave, hopes for her to take the crown prince with her. However, the crown prince with a tone of indifference only asks if she's pretending just to make her pity her. He mentions that Dalsia clearly pities her the more sad she seems and asks if that's how badly she wanted to return to the capital. Aeline immediately beams with joy as she looks at him, wondering if the crown princess is taking her to the capital. The crown prince, looking at her, then comments she does seem to look dumber. Later, the crown princess goes to inform the priest she will be taking Aeline to the temple in the capital. She explains that he isn't taking care of her, adding that she's sure he wouldn't deny that since he's seen all the scars and bruises on her body. The priest denies it, explaining the scars are self-inflicted, but little does he know that his words would only fuel the crown princess' anger further. She springs up in anger and informs him that from that day onward she and the temple will be keeping an eye on Aeline, and he complies. Later, as she tries to catch her breath, the crown prince appears and she immediately turns her attention to him. The crown prince immediately mentions he knows she pities her, however she's a sinner so she doesn't have to, but the crown princess reveals Aeline had used black magic on herself. He appears more shocked and instantly turns around, declaring she must be hanged, while the crown princess tries to hold him back, explains it's not like that. She then explains that the reason why black magic is so dangerous is because not only does it affect the user of the black magic but also the person affected by it, as their souls become possessed by pain. The crown prince responds that he knows that, and she explains that the last time she used black magic on her she was unable to kill her, but as long as she doesn't use it going forward her soul will be able to be saved. The crown prince seems to understand where she's going, and the crown princess continues, revealing Aeline used black magic on herself, saying she wanted herself in hell. The crown prince grows nervous as he mentions Aeline wouldn't do that, asking her if she knows it too. However, Dalsia tells him she doesn't know why she's changed, but something within her has shifted. She explains that something happened to motivate her to desire eternal suffering for her soul, and adds that she could be pertinent to her past. The crown prince then asks if that's why she said she would take her to the capital, and Dalsia explains that she might be penitent of her past, but the capital will be able to restrain her from her feeble black magic. As Dalsia turns, she notes there's another reason. Her parents in return for saving her life, but the crown prince interrupts, stating he knows and agrees with her idea of taking her to the capital. Later, Aeline sits locked up in a wagon, unable to process everything that's happening. She only recalls how several minutes earlier Dalsia came to her and insisted she wouldn't let her continue to harm herself any longer. She thinks of how she's always wanted to go back to the capital anyway, so Dalsia's decision just helped her achieve that, although no one will welcome her there. They didn't arrive until nightfall, and as she's brought in, she reflects on how even the commoners know all about how Aeline made Dalsia's life hell. Little shivers run down her spine as she ponders on her fate. If they had arrived in broad daylight, she could have been stoned to death. Regardless of the outcome, everything all worked out. Now she waves at the guard outside and mouths for him to give her a paper and pen. He hands it to her and she scribbles onto it, and just as she's done the wagon comes to a halt. They arrive at the capital's temple, so huge, and as soon as the guard releases the knot holding her hand, she flees. As she runs, in her mind she's certain he'll be there, just like in the book. Relocation goes there every time he thinks of Dalsia, the temple lake. Relocation, she stands in front of him holding the note in her hand. However, before he can ask how she managed to get there, she presents the note in her hand reading, "Hello husband, please, kill me." His expression hardens and she only wonders if he's looking at her that way because of how unpresentable she looks, but she's certain he shouldn't care. He asks why she's in the capital, however she only shows him the note, repeatedly thinking of how the Saintess had brought her. His expression darkens as he demands to know if she's there to hurt Dalsia again, while she thinks he seems to have believed the rumors, but it's okay anyways since it'll only make him hate her and eager to end her life. How horrible, he remarks as he slides his sword out while she awaits her end eagerly, but the moment is ruined when the knights who'd been chasing after her appear before them. As she watches, waiting, filled with great anticipation of what would happen, she realizes they're not going to stop him. She recoils in defeat as she admits, "Oh, I see. Poor Aeline. Everyone wants you dead, well." The Duke's grip tightens around his sword and with one strike. "No one loves you, that's your fault Aeline, just like voiceless me isn't loved by anybody." She falls to the ground while the Duke still points his blade to her head. Despite the pain in her trembling body, she struggles, determined to tell him one last time what she had to say. A grin forms on her face and as her final words, "Thank you," come out, the Duke's sword hangs in the air, but her end doesn't come yet. The next time she opens her eyes to the Crown Princess yelling her name. She opens her eyes and sits up in confusion as to why she's still alive. The Crown Princess hands her a book and pen and she scribbles some words onto it before turning it to the princess. She asked if she saved her and the Crown Princess admits she did and also shares she was so shocked, mentioning Carloshan had gone too far, questioning who could have thought he would swing his sword as soon as he saw her. She asks why she'd saved her and the Crown Princess admits she couldn't leave her to die. The next time she asks if she thinks the knights there couldn't stop Carloshan and the Crown Princess' face goes pale. She mentions they wanted her to die and adds that everyone except her wishes for the death of Aeline. The Crown Princess tries to offer an explanation but her tongue works against her. On the other hand, Aeline writes, "You should just hate me, that makes the most sense, and don't you ever get involved in my matters again." The Crown Princess steps out asking her to get some rest and she slumps on the bed wondering what to do now. Wasn't that her only opportunity to die? And what happened to the story epilogue? She presses her head on her arms while tears stream down her face as she questions why she's still alive, and at that moment the Duke walks in. As he walks up to her he offers an apology, sharing he hadn't the slightest idea that Dalsia had brought her there. Aeline, moved by his insincerity, scoffs, thinking Dalsia must have given him an earful that he's being forced to apologize. He slices her open and all he has to say is sorry, though she isn't complaining as he's the only one who can save her from that meaningless repetitive life. "He's the only one who can kill me." Then she scribbles on his hand one more time, this time she tells him, "If he's really sorry, then, please kill me." She smiles brightly as the tears pour down her face. She gets up and holds his hand together while he questions what she's doing. She presses his hands around her neck, urging him not to hesitate and instead hurry up. The Duke, however, snatches his hand away hurriedly, and as he watches her fall back he appears shocked and immediately turns away, while she sits on the bed staring blankly, lost in thought. She realizes that won't work either. A few moments earlier, the Duke watches in confusion as Dalsia attempts to heal Aeline and also explains she's the one who brought her there. She explained that she's completely different from before, and the Duke had asked what about the things she said about her in the past. She responds that she doesn't care about that anymore and hands her to a knight to take her as she just recovered. As the knight holds her, the Duke's eyes widen as he notices all those unhealed scars on her body. Once she's taken away, the Duke shares that once he receives news of her gaining consciousness, he'll go to her and apologize, thinking he'll have to learn of her real motivation for approaching him. Pondering on the image of her being taken away, the Duke now sees how many times she's tried to hang herself, noting she has so many obvious scars and also the expression she made. He wonders what she's schemed up now, but then he remembers the words she'd scribbled on his palm, to kill her and not to hesitate. He clenches his fist tightly and scoffs, thinking he's never seen her like that before. Neither has he heard her ever say that, but one thing was certain, she's changed. In a new scene, the High Priest declares he can feel it. He can feel the senses of an evil black magic coming from Aeline. The Crown Princess insists she hadn't used black magic, however the bishop explains that he understands her generosity but she mustn't be seduced by the villainess any longer. However, the Crown Princess insists Aeline is repentful of her past. Aeline, however, scoffs at her statement, wondering why she would be repentful of something she never did. The High Priest, however, insists she spots the black magic flowing in her veins, declaring he has no intention of letting it go at all. The High Priest declares execution as the only answer and she beams with joy at the thought of an end coming for her. Unable to beat the thought of coming between the Duke and Dalsia since she'd have to be killed by Relocation, she tugs at the shirt of the knight behind her. She asks for 3 pages and a pen. Later, she goes to the High Priest and submits the letter down, admitting she is worthy of death. However, if she's allowed one wish, she would like Relocation to be the one who takes her life. She stares at the Duke, happily unaware of what they're thinking, but she remains unbothered, thinking but it seems fine, Relocation, her ex-husband, the only person who can kill her. The next minute she slumps to the ground, holding her throat painfully. Once that painful moment passes, she goes to the High Priest and mouths the word please in tears. The Crown Princess immediately turns to Aeline and pleads with the High Priest to look at her and consider giving her another chance, and he says they'll have a moment to think about it. Later, the High Priest sits with the Crown Princess and Duke, asking what had gone wrong since Aeline is supposed to be a strong character. Aeline, supposed to be the last daughter of the dukedom, she held her head up high wherever she went, and even when her fiancé treated her badly she held her chin up even higher. The Crown Princess, seated, admits she doesn't know the whole detail, but to Aeline she had all sorts of methods seeking to end her own life shown all over her body, and on top of that, the Duke Relocation reveals she mentioned she wished to die by his sword, and since she said that, he concludes she must know about his sword. On the other hand, Aeline lays in bed wondering if the talks about her execution are going smoothly, thinking she'd like Relocation to kill her if possible since she doesn't want to go back to the beginning. Back to their discussion, the High Priest questions who wouldn't recognize his blade, mentioning it was a present from the Emperor himself. There are 2 mythical swords of the Empire. The first is the blade of the royal prince Aretius, symbolizing light and purity, and the second is Relocation's sword Disharmony, symbolizing darkness and punishment. The princess then explains that the punishment refers to how those who are killed by the sword will descend into hell, and how the holder of the blade live out their life in Mania, all of which are rumors, but since Aeline has used black magic before, she might believe such rumors. The High Priest mentions how she has performed black magic on herself multiple times to end her life, so perhaps she desires Relocation's blade to descend her into hell. The Crown Princess also adds that there are many in the world who wish death upon themselves, but very few who are willing to actually attempt it. Aeline has definitely changed, please give her a chance. The High Priest, yet to give an answer, just watches the Crown Princess silently, questioning how she can be so good. Watching her grow up in the temple so good and pure, the High Priest was worried that she might be hurt in her role as Crown Princess, but it doesn't seem to be going like that. The High Priest gives his response, stating he will protect Aeline and suggests she return to the Crown Prince since he must be waiting for her. Outside, the Duke reveals to the High Priest he would like to take charge of Aeline's watch, sharing he feels she has other motives. The High Priest, listening, can only think of how she used to be his wife, wondering how he could be so cold, and to Aeline, too bad to have someone like the Duke as a husband. The High Priest suggests they talk about it later, however the Duke insists and asks if there's any need for the delay, sharing his desire to simply steer the sinner in the right direction. However, the High Priest asks that he leaves it to him. In a new scene, the High Priest introduces a child, Dolan, to Aeline and informs her that the child would be the one to look after her from then on. She wonders why, and as he informs her she'll be staying there from then on, she's distraught as she recalls his words that she would be executed also. She's certain she wants to be at the cemetery and not the temple. The High Priest gently pats her head, sharing they'll make sure she never has those kinds of thoughts again. He takes his leave and she sighs in defeat, but she hears Dolan's call her name and she looks up to respond. He grabs her by her hair. Days pass with Dolan's posted as her watch. He comments that she looks stupid again today and asks how she dares bother the saintess like that, claiming it's so disgusting how she's still alive. Aeline presses her lips in pain. She ponders on how many days has passed since then. The high priest hasn't come to visit her ever since, and her supposed guard. She recalls his words. The boy notes that thinking of everything the saintess had gone through, she has no right to keep on living. He started to hurt her without anyone knowing. Now as she faces him, he asks if it wouldn't be better to die when no one is around, and she agrees with him silently. She acknowledges she doesn't even know why she's in the capital, however she sees the need for her to hold on a little longer. She observes his hitting has reduced these past days and plans to escape once he loses interest. Dolan laughs at her and mentions it seems she's starting to recognize what is going on since she's keeping her mouth shut, and he reveals he thought she'd go tell on him on the first day. He steps outside, and as Aeline holds her head in her palm, she deliberates on the pain. She tries to consider the bright side. She's glad the high priest doesn't know about that, since if he knew Dolan was abusing her, he could station more guards and make it more difficult for her to escape. She rolls up her sleeves, revealing the wounds, and thinks of how Dolan's only hurts her in places that aren't really visible, even down to her stomach and thighs, so she's confident she must escape. A few days later, she throws herself on the bed in boredom. She questions if perhaps that's why prisoners hate being in single cells, and also she notices Dolan's hasn't appeared in a little while, so maybe she should start plotting, but the next moment she hears the door slam open. This time he walks up to her angrily and grabs her by her hair as he mumbles about the old officials looking down on him. His gaze immediately turns to Aeline, and the next moment he strikes her in the face. As she drops to the floor trembling, he shares people only look down on him because he has to take care of someone like her. He insists it's all because of her yelling, everyone hates her. You need to die. Unable to put up with the abuse any longer, she grabs a chair and slams it on him and immediately dashed out of the room to find the high priest urgently. She turns around and notices Dolan has already caught up with her. Unlucky for her, she doesn't pay attention to her next steps and trips over her foot, causing her to fall to the ground. Before she can get up, he grabs her leg, cursing under his breath, and then he clenches his fist to hit her. However, his action is interrupted by the Duke, who appears. Dolan immediately goes on his knees, muttering in fear, while the Duke again demands to know what is going on. Dolan, still trembling, explains he was only educating her as she threw a chair at him and attempted to escape. The Duke doesn't let him off and asks if then a priest resorted to violence, but he points out she's a sinner. The Duke, however, mentions he's sure the high priest ordered him to take good care of Aeline. He stutters, and when his stutters finally clears, he stutters an apology. However, the Duke angrily orders him to keep his mouth shut. He brings out his sword, and as soon as Aeline notices, she leaps up and goes in front of him. The Duke, confused, asks her what she's doing, while she thinks she of course wants him to kill her first before he kills him. He asks if she's trying to protect him, and she shakes her head, wondering why would she. She's just desperate to die, that's all. Or you're utterly mad. The Duke lets out a sigh as he returns his sword and admits he wouldn't kill him, but he has to be punished for what he did. The Duke pauses and then lifts her face and mutters, "Your face." She remains confused, wondering what is wrong with her face since Aeline is supposed to be beautiful, while the Duke on the other hand only observes how fresh the wounds on her face are and immediately turns to Dolan's. The previous temple ignored Aeline, and Dolan's the priest here. She can't exactly blame him either, as sinners deserve to be treated like that. However, the Duke walks up to him, and as he raises his head to meet his gaze, the Duke presses his foot on his back, ignoring his screams. Aeline, however, just in time grabs his hand, and after a while he agrees he'll stop. The next minute he pulls her with him away while she wonders where he's going, thinking she wanted to see him beat the priest to a pulp. He takes her to the high priest, who immediately rushes to her as soon as he spots the bruises on her face. The Duke mentions to the high priest how he promised the crown princess that he would take good care of Aeline, while she watches in awe, wondering if he is standing up for her. She turns her head and notices a pen and note on the high priest's table, and the next moment she hands a note asking when she's scheduled to be executed to the high priest with a smile. The high priest, however, hurriedly admits it was mainly an oversight on his part and she'll be able to be saved, so he urges her not to think of such things. The Duke speaks again. This time he shares with the priest. He thinks it would be best for him to keep an eye on Aeline. He also mentions that Dalsia would be worried if she knows of Aeline's current situation, so he should keep it between them, and the high priest agrees. Before he takes his leave, the Duke mentions that the priest who took care of Aeline need to be punished and the High Priest agrees. He turns to Aeline and asks her to come with him. Outside, the priests murmur about how they heard Dolan's had hit a sinner. Aeline, lost in thought, thinks of how the rumors are already spreading, but a smile forms on her face as she considers the optimistic side. It wouldn't matter since the Duke plans to keep it a secret from Dalsia and murder her in private, right? She beams with joy as she admits, "Fine, I'm ready." The Duke turns around, paying no heed to her when a voice drives his movements to a pause. Dolan exclaims that he hadn't done anything wrong. Despite being brought to his knees, he tries to make sense, explaining to the High Priest that Aeline likening her to a demon deserved to die in the first place. But Aeline is not shaken by his words. Instead, her expression remains the same as she totally agrees with his words. He's not entirely wrong to her, but something's wrong. The next time she turns, she notices the Duke already closing up on him. His lips slowly parts open as he brings out his sword. He mentions he's sure he told him to shut his mouth. The High Priest, however, pleads on his behalf and explains he will punish him accordingly and asks the Duke not to kill him. However, the Duke just asks the High Priest to step aside. Fear creeps in his mind and he begins pleading for mercy. However, the Duke swings his sword at his throat and he drops to the floor the next minute. That incident alone was shocking, but what was more surprising was when the Duke turned to Aeline, he found tears dropping down her face. She ponders on her feelings. It's jealousy. She walks up to him and as she watches over his body she thinks, she's the one who wanted to die so badly, so why did he get to die instead? What am I even doing here? The High Priest leaves with the Duke, but before he leaves he orders the priests to clean up while they all exchange whispers to confirm if they'd all seen the same thing. How could she shed tears over the death of her abuser? In a new scene, she sits in a carriage wondering where he's taking her until an attendant announces that they've arrived at their destination. Once she gets down, a wave of familiarity comes down her path and she soon realizes they are in the estate of the Dinabeth dukedom. He informs the butler of the estate that she'll be staying in the annex and orders him to prepare a room for her. The man, in shock, addressing her as Madam, asks how she's there, while the Duke, with a tone of indifference, mentions she isn't the lady of the house again and instead asks that he treats her as a criminal. He apologizes and the Duke explains that he brought her there because he needs to keep an eye on her and also asks him to have 3 staff members on her at all times, never letting her go anywhere herself, and lastly to report immediately if she does anything strange. Before the Duke walks away, he leaves him a last order, that he shows her around the manor. In the hallway, the Duke walks, he reveals how she tried to protect someone who tried to hurt her. She did it then and again, she even wept. The Duke, however, dismisses these thoughts. Instead, he reminds himself how she tried to kill Dalsia and even used black magic. To him, although Dalsia seems to trust her, she's got to have an ulterior motive. He recalls some of Aeline's words. "You're always looking at her," when a voice from inside him suggests. "Maybe she turned evil because of you." He pushes through it and asks for his medicine, and he's told it's been prepared in his chamber. Just as he walks inside, he grows weaker while the voice intensifies. "She couldn't have been evil from the beginning. Who drove her to what she did? Kill her." He struggles with the voice inside, yelling for it to shut up, and lastly it asks, "Take her and strangle her." On the other hand, the man shows Aeline to her room in the annex. Also, he passes her a pen and paper and almost immediately she begins scribbling on it. In the book she asks if he can prepare a knife and a bottle for her and he says yes, but he asks why, to which she responds, writing she just needs to bottle something up. Carloshan Dinabeth, he's always surrounded by all sorts of rumors. A murderer, a berserker, he and his blade Desvertia, are always spoken about, even saying that he suffers from mania, and the only person who was able to care for him was the saintess, who confidently shared he was nothing like that to her, rather he was simply just Carloshan Dinabeth. He probably can't even forget about her, even if she became another man's wife. As she examines the bottle, she thinks although the novel is supposed to be a lovely little romance piece, but to think Carloshan not having any thoughts of taking her for his own, is that true love? She holds the bottle, certain that amount of blood should be enough to do the trick. She doesn't believe the Duke will kill her calmly, so she schemed up a plan to use black magic to kill herself, even though she has no idea how to use black magic, so all she needs to do is just pretend. As planned, the servants appear scared as they confront the scary writing on the wall that they immediately send for the Duke. To her surprise, the Duke appears and just looks confused. He stands in front of her and asks why she did something so pointless. He mentions that it's nothing, he feels nothing, and asks if she'd forgotten how to use black magic. She drops to the floor in defeat while the Duke remarks that she's clearly suffering from some kind of mental illness and orders them to clean up the mess. The Duke turns back to Aeline and immediately grabs her hand. He mentions they need to treat her first and orders them to call the doctors. He pulls her out of the room, and as he drags her, she manages to write on his arm that it hurts, and he pauses for a while. Then he lets go and then retorts that if she doesn't like the feeling of pain, he has no idea how she did all that to herself, and he orders her to come with him. In a new scene, Aeline successfully received treatment, but just as she observed her fresh look, she looks up to the maids watching her, who ask that she comes with them. Turns out they wanted to help her take a bath. They take her to another room and reveal that is where she'll be staying now. They inform her that they'll be taking their leave and urge her to ring the bell if she needs anything. Outside, the maids discuss. The other ask if she removed all the blades, and she says yes. Then she mentions, the madam doesn't seem to be in her right mind. Also, she questions what those scars all over her are, and the bruises on her neck, also the scars on her arms that look like knife marks. The maid mentions she didn't really hate her before, and the other one adds that she's right, although she complained a lot, she never hurt them. She also mentions how one time when she was cleaning a vase and cut her hand, she had treated her immediately, and also she even forgave her for the mistake she made that one time. The maids lean in closer and finally they conclude, "Madam, the Duke drove her to mental illness, so they must take it upon themselves to treat her as best as they can while she's still there with them." That wasn't the end of Ariadne's antics, but humans are adaptive creatures. Whenever a scream sounded within the household, automatically everyone thought she was up to something again and would instantly go to the Duke. This time, Ariadne had made a handmade voodoo doll. To stop them from coming any closer, even to clean up the glass shards, she waves the note back and forth asking if they wanted to get cursed. A maid, tired of her antics, had pushed to clean up the shard regardless, however she ended up getting cut, attracting Ariadne's immediate attention. Her eyes got teary as she apologized over and over in her head, and it is at the moment the Duke appears. He effortlessly picks her up, but the moment doesn't just go like that as she diverts his attention to the injured maid. The Duke, focused on her blood-dripping feet, asks if she realizes the state of her own feet, but rather she only urges him to take care of the maid, and he ends up calling the maid to come with them. He takes Ariadne to the doctor, however, she insists again that the maid be treated first. She asks her to come, mentioning she would be the first to receive treatment, however the maid turns down her nice gesture, explaining that her wounds should be of more urgency. The Duke, noticing she wouldn't back down, turns to the maid and with a slight irritated tone asks that she just does as Ariadne wishes. As the doctor treats her wounds, the maid only reflects on her feelings. She feels bad for being mad at the madam earlier, just now realizing she's only mentally and physically worn out. Once the doctor is done treating the maid, he invites Ariadne over and after checking her feet informs her that since the glass shards are embedded quite deeply, he'd have to remove them before treating her. She reaches for the Duke out of fear while he glances at her and thinks he knows she's sensitive to pain, and yet, she insists on others being treated for their cuts first. Her grip around the Duke's arm tightens as the glass shards are pulled out, while through the pain she only reminisces on how she failed again today, but not only that, she'd let someone else hurt themselves. The doctor finishes, and as he shares his worries about her always getting herself into trouble, her eyes go teary as she begins to feel bad for inconveniencing the doctor. The Duke, however, only calls her and asks if she's done acting out now. She turns to him, her gaze hostile, and then hands him a note saying, "We were poor but we had been happy." The Duke crumples the note in his hand. He suggests maybe it'd be better to just tie her up in her room, and as she shrieks in terror he suggests, "Then behave yourself." The maid opts to go clean the room and she springs up immediately, however the maid turns down her help, stating she could get hurt again. She drops to the chair in defeat as she thinks the maid feels uncomfortable around her. Suddenly the Duke mentions thanks to her he can't concentrate on his work and neither can the staff. As she watches him leave, she admits she's guilty of that, but all of that would be solved if he would just kill her. Before he takes his leave, the Duke discloses someone will be coming by the house the next day and asks her to be a good girl. At night, Aeline rushes out of the palace. Since a guest will be coming, she's certain the whole staff will be busy, which means they wouldn't be able to keep an eye on her. She goes to the Duke's bedroom and is surprised to find there is not even a single guard stationed outside of the Duke doors, and also the locks just open up like that until she hears some strange noises. She walks in to find Carloshan in pain on the bed. As she watches him struggle in pain on the bed, she finally realizes the rumors are true. The Duke does indeed suffer from mania. She's able to recall from Ariadne's memories that there was a time when she and Carloshan used separate rooms. He used the room on the uppermost floor at the end of the hall and Aeline used the room on the bottommost floor. He wanted Aeline to never come anywhere close to his bedroom, and Aeline with her resolute ego didn't go, which is why she thought coming to his room would make him hate her. She snaps back to reality at the voice of the Duke asking her to leave. As he pants heavily, he asks if she hadn't heard him ordering her once again to get out. However, Aeline, curious, questions if that's what mania is and if it has anything to do with that shining sword standing behind the couch. She turns to the Duke, but instead of leaving him to suffer alone that night, she walks up to him while he urges her not to come any closer. She stands in front of him feeling bad for using a sick man, however that could be the moment. Reaching for his face, she continues, that he finally kills her. The Duke, despite his struggles, asks if she has no intentions of heeding to his words, and she carefully mouths a question. What does mania feel like? He looks stunned, and again she asks if it's very terrible or perhaps if his impulses govern him. Just as he's about to ask what she's saying, the voice begins. It urges him to choke her, make sure she can't speak again. He pleads with her to leave, however she takes his hand and asks if he wants to kill her and then gives him her permission. Then, at least for this one night, you'll be at peace. The Duke grits his teeth and immediately pulls her onto the bed. Settling above her, he asks if she really wants to die. He wraps his hand around her neck and a grin of satisfaction forms on her face. The voice intensifies, urging him to kill her so he never has to see her again, however he just pleads weakly for it to stop. Aeline, however, takes his hand, slides it back around her neck and asks that he doesn't let go and just go ahead. Through gritted teeth, he demands to know what she knows. She raises her trembling hand and softly pats the Duke, assuring him it's okay, explained none of that is his fault. It's all my fault, this is finally the end, her neck snaps. But she opens her eyes to find herself alive again, laying covered in blood with a wounded stomach, back to the day Carloshan first cut her. In a new scene, Aeline opens her eyes wondering if she's back in the temple while Carloshan asks if she's up. She looks up to find Carloshan with a pleasant expression that leave her confused, as it is Dalsia who is supposed to be by her bedside. So why has the past changed? Angered by how he casually asks if she's up after slicing her in half, she mutters under her breath, and only when he asks what she just said does she realize she can actually talk now. She dashes to the mirror and notices the marks around her neck appear fainter, and she can't help but laugh out loudly. Wondering, who knows, she might actually be able to sing again, and she would be satisfied with even just a little bit, if she could sing again before she dies. The Duke grows tired of watching her and snaps. He asks what she's doing, noting she's just got up, however she's only occupied with curiosity as to why her wounds are beginning to heal and why her voice is finally back. This experience is new, unlike the previous times she's been reawakened. A striking possibility settles in her head as she wonders if by chance it's because it's the first time she's been killed by another person. Is it because Carloshan killed her? Now she arrives at a conclusion. She doesn't know what happened, however perhaps Carloshan is the key to her looping timelines. Not everything aligns with the original plot and she isn't certain, but maybe she'll find out if she tries one more time. Husband, she declared boldly, but he corrects her and clarifies that he isn't her husband. Then ex-husband, to grasp whatever threads she can, as she faces him with a strong plea, she concludes she must have him kill her again. She steps forward with her plea, and just as she's about to utter the words, "Kill me," she begins coughing out blood, an eye-opener that she isn't fully healed yet. The Duke, wiping her face with his handkerchief, confesses, "I killed you, but after I came to find myself in the past." As he explains that he doesn't exactly know what he's saying, she only stares at him in shock as she processes, "Am I back, with Relocation this time around?" She also tells him she doesn't know what's going on either, coughing still. He guides her to sit and then hands her a book and pen, noticing she's not in proper condition to speak just yet. So she proceeds to write on the paper. She doesn't know why he's back there with her. The Duke, confused, asks why she's so calm about the whole situation, and she explains that it's because it isn't the first time it has happened to her. She admits she's been brought back multiple times, and he asks how many times exactly, and she thinks she doesn't know since she gave up counting after 50. Then she writes maybe above 100 times, and a shred of dread spreads across the Duke's face. Shocked, he exclaims and then drops his head into his palm, letting out a sigh before moving past her statement and acknowledging at least they know for sure now that they've been brought back to the past. In the paper she writes that she's thinking about why the two of them were brought back together, but there could be two possible explanations. The first is he killed her, which makes the most sense now, and the second is perhaps due to his mania. She shares her observation. She'd noticed the light emitting the Desrotia before she died. So as she scribbles, she stops at a conclusion: maybe there's some kind of connection between Relocation himself and how the cycle has shifted. In her book again, she writes how up until now she's killed herself, and it's the first time someone else has done it for her, and that must seem to be the most plausible reason at that point to explain why he's back there with her. However, the Duke interrupts her. He asks if she's telling him she's ended her life herself all those times, and she nods. He snatches the book from her hand to ensure he has her attention before he asks again. "So you come back every time you die, and you've repeated this 100 times so far?" Aeline, however, just stares at him blankly, wondering why he keeps on dwelling on that alone. The Duke snaps and declares that means she's killed herself every single time. Aeline rather confidently declares, which is why he is all she has. She explains that she realized that just now, opening her eyes in that place again, he's the only one who can release her from that tremendous cycle. So please, clenching her fist, she pleads with him to take her life one more time so she can know for sure if it is really he who can put an end to that. However, unexpectedly the Duke slowly speaks, asking her not to ask that of him. Looking down weakly, he admits he doesn't want to be a husband that killed his wife, and Aeline's gaze softens the minute she recalls Relocation experienced a past he really shouldn't have. House Dinabeth was one of the dukedoms of the Empire: Atripa Dinabeth the Duke, Viola Dinabeth the Duchess, and their son Relocation Dinabeth. The Duke fought valiantly in many wars and received Desrotia, the blade of the Emperor. However, once he began to wield Desrotia, House Dinabeth was swept up in what was called the tragedy of the Dinabeths. Relocation, young, had staggered into his parents' room and faced an horrific sight. With tears streaming down his face, he pleaded with his father to stop. Possessed by mania, the Duke killed his beloved wife in front of the young master. As she trembles under the weight of his hands around her neck, she managed to call out to him, "Beloved." Their son intervened, trying to get his father off. However, possessed by mania, he was struck by his father and his mother with her last breath, pleased with him to return to his room and remain there. Foolishly and disappointingly, his two legs had no strength in them to hoist him back up. There was nothing he could do, and all he could manage was to crawl and hide under the very bed where his father was strangling his mother to death. Terrified, he pressed his eyes shut, wondering how his father could do that to his mom, and why only, until he heard her voice break. "Atripa, don't worry, this isn't your fault. I still love you." In that silent room, after his mother's words faded away, all he could hear was his father's foreign animal-like sounds, and all he could manage was to pray that his father would return to his normal self. And finally, when the sun rose and he was faced with the consequences of his action, terrible wails rose from his father. Rubbing his eyes, he emerged from underneath the bed, wondering if his father had finally come to his senses. However, he was unaware of the new horror awaiting him. His father stood tiredly by the window, and as he called him questionably, he watched his father drop to his demise. Little him, not knowing anything, stood confused of his father's whereabouts. "Father, you left me alone. Is it truly you who just fell out the window? Then mother, he screamed in terror after realizing his mother's body stiff and the servants rushed to him. According to the novel, The Tragedy of the Denabeths, Atripa Dinabeth suffered from PTSD after the war and killed his wife, after which her took his own life. Now watching the Duke, she calls herself an idiot, unable to believe those details only came now to her. She notices his shaky hands and without hesitation grabs it as she shares the royal prince's wedding was the previous day. Her voice breaks into an apology, however the Duke asks why she's apologizing to him. You were never this way, he adds. But her response is unexpected. She tells him he knows nothing about her. She explains that he was never curious to find out what kind of person she was, and it would be a lie if she said that never hurt her. A strong silence follows, then the Duke finally mutters, "Hurt." Then he speaks more coherently. "What I've done to you all this time, did I hurt you?" She stares at him in confusion. It came as a shock and she wonders what to do. Then she admits yes, adding how he carried his prejudices about her. He looks down, shaken by her words, and just as he's about to speak she interrupts and mentions she's fine now. A bright smile spreads across her face as she explains she's used to such circumstances, so, please don't worry about it. The Aeline he can remember was a villain through and through. She enjoyed humiliating and torturing people at all times, and throughout her wedded time with Carlosian they never conversed truly, which begs the questions. Who was this woman now? He stutters, pressing his eyes down in defeat. Then finally he rises. He shares he'll take her to the high priest and speak, adding if she remains there she'll suffer in the hands of that priest again. Once the Duke steps out of the room he pauses as a question comes to his mind. Is it because of me she's lost the will to live? He begins thinking of her. The Aeline now is entirely different from what he can remember. She has a soft expression on her face unbefitting of the Empire's villainess. She seems like a different person. He runs into Dalsia on his way and she immediately inquires about Aeline's situation. She sighs in relief as he gives her a reassuring response. However, the Duke causes the atmosphere to be tense again as he mentions he has something to ask her. Who was Aeline to you? She looks up shocked and he mentions she mustn't have good memories about her. However, to his surprise, Dalsia responds that she feels like an abandoned kitten. She goes ahead to describe how kittens react whenever they meet strangers. Then Carlotina asks why and she explains that everything she's done so far it feels like she's been trying to avoid getting hurt herself. She then adds that the only way she probably knew how to defend herself from getting hurt was to attack. She wanted to protect herself. She then explains that every time Aeline mistreated her, she always looked so hurt. The Duke mentions how she cursed her and she jokingly admits yes, that was wrong of her and she's hated her at times for that too. Then she explains that's what being human is, right? Meaning, the Duke completes her sentence, meaning no one is evil all the time. He recalls Aeline and thinks this isn't your fault. The Saintess then reveals she has her regrets and she wishes she had recognized her wounds sooner. She mentions she probably regrets so many of her actions now and pleads with Carlosian to give her a chance. But behind his clenched fist, he held a deep thought. But Dalsia, these hands, they've already killed her once. He assures Dalsia he will and she immediately brightens up. The Duke thinks of how Dalsia always has a pleasant smile on her face. However, what his thoughts are drawn to now are Aeline. On the other hand, after Aeline arrived at Carlosian's home, she was kindly washed and guided to her room. Though her voice isn't fully healed, she's so sleepy and decides she'll think about that after the nap. All of a sudden, she opens her eyes in terror. She curls up on the bed with the pain in her head feeling like it's splitting open, and an unfamiliar voice that mentions he abandoned her. It asks if she doesn't hate him and urges her to kill him, choke him, strangle him, don't let anyone else have him. Meanwhile, the Duke in his office receives the news that Aeline is already asleep and had fallen asleep early. He holds a document in his hand as he repeats, she's already asleep. The butler reports he was informed she fell asleep before the sunset and the Duke replies that it's interesting. He orders him to have his medicated room prepared and he takes his leave. Left alone, the Duke wishes time hadn't turned back to this moment. He thinks his mania usually worsens before and after the full moon, and the full moon has already passed. He taps his table gently, thinking he'll have to take his medication to fall asleep. However, he thinks he can't always rely on medication, so he'll have to find a real solution soon. But then, his sword in the corner begins glowing and swirling on its own. An alarming occurrence. Then he ponders, Despertia is already shining, but I don't have any symptoms. Suddenly the butler dashes into his office and urges him to come, noting it's an urgent matter. The madam is showing signs of seizure. As he struggles to believe and thinks no way, his butler breaks the silence again as he informs him her symptoms resembles his. The Duke arrives in the room to find the servants struggling to hold her down while she mentions that it hurts. She screams in pain while the Duke's eyes widens as he realizes she's acting just like he did. The servants, upon noticing him, inform him the lady keeps trying to harm herself while they're trying to stop her. He rushes to her, calling her name while she calls his name with tears pouring down her face. The Duke, looking at her, admits he knows this look. She's suffering from mania. Has my curse transferred to her? I should have realized when she said traveling back in time is linked with mania. He orders the butler to bring his medication, however her struggles only intensifies. He orders all the servants to leave instantly, and when they're alone, he pours a mouthful of the medicine into his mouth and passes it into hers in the form of a kiss. Once she receives the medicine, she goes calm a bit and gasps for air while the Duke watches, thinking of how the medicine doesn't work instantly, but if that could calm her down just a bit. When suddenly she begins stating, "You abandoned me." Pressing her hand formed in a fist, she admits, "You always make me feel so pathetic, Carlosian. You could have looked my way just once." The Duke, afraid that she'll hurt herself in the process of hitting his chest with her tender hand, her holds it together, but that doesn't prepare him for what's coming. "I love you, Carlosian." She looks up at him, tears dropping as she pleads, "Please, just love me now." The next morning she lays in bed with the Duke in regret, struggling to believe her attitude the previous night. She squeezed onto the sheet tightly, hoping she didn't remember the incident at all, but she does, and even worse, everything is crystal clear in her memory, even the kiss, although it was for medical purposes. But the most humiliating part was her clinging onto him and pleading for his love. She springs up in embarrassment and questions if she really feels like that inside. The next moment, she panics as the Duke greets her. She tries to play innocent of what had happened the previous night, however the Duke doesn't look like he's in the mood to put up with her act. Immediately he appears in front of her and asks if she really doesn't remember, and she mentions she does only a little. Noticing the scratches on his hands, she questions if she made those scratches while the Duke suggests they need to see the doctor. She asks the Duke if the scratches hurt that much, however he only asks her to look at her hand, and her mouth widens in shock. At the doctor while she's being treated, the Duke immediately mentions it seems her cough has stopped. She immediately offers to borrow a mirror. Looking in the mirror, she notices the bruises have lightened, but since Carlosian didn't kill her this time, she questions what is going on. She tries to sing, however she ends up coughing again. In the distance the Duke makes a comment that she seems obsessed with her voice and asks why. Then she reveals once her voice heals she can start singing, and he asks if she ever took up singing. She reveals she took it up as a hobby at the monastery, and he says he sees. Then he suggests they go home since they have lots to talk about. They get back and the Duke proceeds. He mentions the mania and suggests they think of why it could have transferred to her. Then she asks if it is because he killed her with his sword, adding that the symptoms began after they went back in time together. However, the Duke glares at her, causing her to get nervous as she explains it's the truth. She drops her teacup and asks him to tell her more about the Despertia, stating she knows it's intimately connected with mania. The Duke then explains the sword is laced with black magic. He explains it may look like a regular sword, but whenever nightfall comes it reeks of black magic. The Duke then adds that black magic must be the connection there since she used black magic on Dalsia, however she interrupts and explains about that. She hesitates before explaining she really hadn't cursed the saintess, thinking she has to make that known. However, the Duke's flares up. Again with that nonsense, is it that difficult for you to own up to your own wrongdoings? She tries to explain, however he drops his tea violently, declaring there's no point in him listening to her anymore. He orders her to leave, cursing beneath his teeth, whilst glaring at her. He shuts her out and she walks down the hall in anger, thinking he only ever overreacts whenever it comes to Dalsia. She admits she knows it angers him and he doesn't want to believe her. However, he could at least pretend to try to listen to her. At the palace, the crown princess, Yermondi pauses and then asks with a bright smile, "What did you just say?" The maid then repeats she had said Aeline is back in the capital, but the princess mentions it's the one she said after. Then the maid, realizing, mentions she's staying at Duke Carloshan's home, but the crown princess immediately snaps. With a laugh, she asks, "So Carloshan took her in?" The princess then asks about what she asked her to do, and the maid confirms that the rumors of her engagement to the duke are successfully spreading across the land. The princess drops to the couch and admits she thinks the duke might come to his senses once the rumors began making their rounds. Thinking, as the rumor says, if their engagement doesn't materialize, the emperor will act, since he's the one who cares the most about the image of the royal family, and if he wishes to protect her, of course he'll make it happen. However, it just so happens that Carloshan took his ex-wife back into his home. She immediately orders the maid to bring her the item from the secret safe, and after she leaves, she looks, thinking, Aeline, I must get rid of her, the girl is getting on my nerves." On the other hand, Aeline processes everything. No matter how she thinks about it, she sees she's the only one who was wrong there. She recalls the princess's words, the duke was supposed to be hers, and as she parades she thinks from all she can remember, the princess was behind it all, and Aeline really doesn't know how to curse people. She questions if she has to do more research into black magic when she feels a throbbing pain in her head. A familiar voice rings in her head and she realizes it's Aeline's voice. Then she begins muttering some words, and in a flash, black flames surround her, but then it stops. She's stuck in a daze, thinking of how her lips had moved on their own, but then the duke bursts in at that moment and confronts her, asking, "Look what you've done, do you still insist on being innocent?" She explains it's all a misunderstanding, but the duke doesn't buy it and instead asks if she was trying to curse Dalsia again, but she refuses and then pauses mid-explanation when she catches on to something. The look in his eyes, glaring at her with such contempt, that made her question if that's what Aeline experienced all the time. She pulls herself together and declares she didn't do it. Then she declared if she finds out who the real culprit was, what would he do about it then? But he just lets out a tiny scoff and retorts, if she does, he'll get on his knees and apologize. Then, still looking at him strongly, she asks him not to ever forget what he just said. She dashes off and his instincts are triggered when he hears a loud noise. He immediately turns to her, asking her to wait, but it's too late, and as he watches her fall back he only thinks he had forgotten. Once the sun sets, the mania returns. The next minute, the duke calls her name in a panic while she opens her eyes, visibly struggling with loud huffs. He asks how she's doing, stating they treated what they could of her fall, but the mania will continue, so she must take the medication. He asks if she can hear him while she only reaches for him, deliberating on her pain, and throws herself in his arms. The duke, flustered, asks her to wait, however the same look of dread returns to his eyes the moment she pleads with him again. "Please, kill me, if you can't love me then, be the one who ends it all for me. Carloshan, my love, listen to me, I'm dead, all because of you." Thanks for watching, guys. I apologize for the long break I took, but I assure you guys I'm back full time and with more amazing recaps. You could also comment down below an idea for the next video. Thank you so much for the support, I love you all.